The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. Johnny was stunned. Stunned and shocked. Shocked and angry. It was as if the professor had said, "Come on, let's throw a party," when he tried to speak. Johnny found that all he could do was sputter and stammer. "Professor, I mean, how could you? The professor was unmoved. He did not act like he had said anything outrageous. "I mean it, John. It may sound a bit unlikely to you right now, but, well, tell you what. After supper, I'm going to be making a cake, and I'd appreciate some kitchen help. Why don't you come over after you've eaten, and I'll explain my immodest proposal, okay?" Johnny just stared at the professor. He was genuinely puzzled. He knew that the professor was not a hard or unfeeling person. Maybe when he explained what he had on his mind, it would all make sense. "Okay," he said hesitantly. I'll come over later." And Johnny turned abruptly and walked back to the house. Supper that night was really pretty awful. It was another example of Grandpa's horrible cooking. The hamburgers were not only overdone, they were charred. Instead of mashed potatoes, there was a slice of Wonder Bread. And the canned peas had been cooked so long they tasted like mushy green spit wads. After one bite of the hamburger, Johnny went out to the kitchen cupboard and brought out all the sauces and condiments he could find. The A1 sauce, ketchup, mustard, and Heinz 57 sauce. And with the aid of these, he managed to choke the food down. Grandpa never said a word all through the meal. It was painful just to look at him. As soon as he could, Johnny excused himself and went across the street. When Johnny arrived, the professor was all done up in one of his chef's outfits. A big white apron and a puffy white hat. On the kitchen table were boxes of flour and sugar, a bottle of milk, a can of baking powder, and some tiny bottles of vanilla extract and artificial food coloring. In front of the professor was a big green crockery bowl with some creamy yellow cake mixture in it. When he saw Johnny, the professor looked up quickly and grinned. Using a big wooden spoon, he began to stir the batter. "Now then," he said brusquely, "where were we? Ah, yes, I was trying to convince you to go away for a while. Do you want to know why? Well, it's all very simple. You're not doing your grandma any good by being here. You may think you are, but you're not. If you go to visit her in the hospital, you'll find that she's in a rather strange state, and after the operation she'll be sleeping a lot. When you're at home, you'll see that your grandpa is not much fun to be with. The two of you will just sit around making each other moody." The professor paused. He dipped his finger into the raw batter, came up with a big sticky gob, and put it in his mouth. The professor had a passion for raw cake batter. "So, John," he went on as he stirred, "I think you should go somewhere. As you know, next week is Massachusetts State Physical Fitness Week." Johnny was dumbfounded. What was the connection between Physical Fitness Week and going on a vacation? Between October 1 and 7, kids in all the grade schools in the state would go to lectures and slideshows and movies and panel discussions on physical fitness instead of attending classes. In Dunstan Heights, there would be special events like relay races and baseball and tug-of-war every day out in the athletic field. All this left Johnny cold. He was not a big athlete. He could just barely play softball, but not well enough to please the tough kids who ran things on the St. Michael's school playground. At all other sports, he was a complete washout, and so he was expecting to spend Physical Fitness Week standing on the sidelines and watching other kids have fun. "Yeah," said Johnny sullenly, I know all about Physical Who's This Week. What the heck does that have to do with going someplace on vacation?" The professor held up a gooey forefinger. It has this to do with it, my fine feathered friend. As part of the big whoop-de-doo on this wonderful week of Boy Scouts from the As part of the big whoop-de-doo of this wonderful week, a group of Boy Scouts from this area is going to take a bus trip into the White Mountains to a scout camp near Lake Chakarua. When they get there, they're going to spend a glorious, delightful week hiking along mountain trails and singing around campfires and having a grand time. You'll enjoy it. I know you will, and it'll be 1,000,000 times better than moping around at home. What do you say, eh? Can I twist your arm?" Johnny looked doubtful. The whole thing sounded like it would be fun, but, well, he didn't think he ought to be having fun right now. It would be like going to a movie on the afternoon of somebody's mother's funeral. "I don't think Grandpa would want me to go," he said. The professor snorted and added a handful of sugar to the batter. "Oh, yes, he would. He might deny it. But at this point, I think he'd be extremely glad to have you somewhere else for a short time." Johnny picked up the measuring spoons and clacked them together. He was really torn. He liked the Boy Scouts, and he loved the White Mountains, and hiking was something he could do. It'd cost a lot of money, wouldn't it? Oh, I'll pay for it, said the professor, shrugging carelessly. What's the use of having money in the bank if you can't do something nice with it? Now come on, be a good sport and say yes. Johnny was still uncertain, and since the professor had decided that no more good would come of coaxing and wheedling, they agreed that Johnny would think about the professor's plan until tomorrow. Johnny stayed and helped the professor with his baking. The cake came out perfectly, and after the professor made Ma Perkins' own spice frosting, the two of them sat down to gobble. Then the professor went back across the street with Johnny and half of the cake on a plate. Then the professor went back across the street with Johnny and half of a cake on a plate inside an aluminum cake carrier. Johnny went up to his room and read while the professor sat down to talk to his old friend Grandpa Dixon. He wanted to visit with Grandpa and cheer him up, and of course he also wanted to do a little persuading. A few days later, on Sunday, October 1st, Johnny was riding northward in a school bus full of Boy Scouts. In the metal rack above his seat was a backpack, his cardboard suitcase, and his sleeping bag. Johnny was wearing his Boy Scout uniform, and all around him were other boys in uniform. They had just finished singing 98 Bottles of Beer on the Wall, the song that is calculated to drive bus drivers out of their minds. Now, while most of the boys were talking and laughing and pestering each other, Johnny sat quietly, staring at the ring binder filled with notes on his lap. On the seat next to him was an illustrated guidebook from the Glomus mansion. He was working on the Glomus puzzle, trying to make sense of the objects on the late serial king's official office table. He didn't really expect to solve the mystery. This was just something he had brought along to pass the time. As usual, Johnny was approaching the whole thing logically, trying to list all the qualities of the objects on the table. But oddly enough, logic wasn't helping him much. Chess set, material, wood and ivory, arrangement just the way it is before a game starts, design, Staunton, newspaper, language, Greek. Material, coarse paper known as newsprint, lettering of the headline, large black letters in Greek alphabet. Words circled in red means Herald. The whole title means National Herald. Signboard, material wood. Don't know what kind. Notes, wood is pretty beat up. Probably was outdoors for a long time. Blue letters say, Ye Olde Tea Shop. Johnny looked glumly at the orderly list that he had made. No, it was not much help. On the other hand, he was proud of what he had been able to find out about this curious collection of things. The guidebook had helped a lot. It had a close-up color picture of the table with the puzzle on it, and another close-up picture of the Greek newspaper. The professor had told Johnny the meaning of the Greek words, and Johnny himself had added the information about the Staunton design. Johnny was a chestnut, and he knew that the Staunton design was the most common. All this information was fine, just fine, except for one little thing. It didn't bring Johnny any closer to solving the puzzle. Johnny sighed. He picked up the guidebook that lay beside him and began to leaf absent-mindedly through it. He looked again at the picture of the table with its mysterious collection of objects. This was all he had to go on. It would have been nice if he could have popped back to Gildersleeve, where the mansion was, before the bus trip began, but Gildersleeve was 40 miles from Dustin Heights. The trip would have taken too much time. Still, it would have been nice to have another look at the clues. Clues, schmooze, he said to himself as he slammed the book shut and threw it back down on the seat. The professor was probably right. The puzzle was a cruel, pointless joke. It could not be solved and was not meant to be solved. It was just something that Mr. Glomus had whipped up to drive his family crazy. Why was Johnny so interested in this idiotic puzzle anyway? Was it just because he liked difficult mental challenges? No, there was something else too. There was the reward, $10,000 for anyone who could figure out the hiding place of the will. He would use the money to pay for Grandma's operation. Johnny knew that operations were expensive. Grandma and Grandpa were poor. There was one more reason why Johnny was going after the will. Like a lot of people, he was always hoping that someday he would get to do something terribly distinguished and exciting, like finding a lost city buried under the sands of Egypt. The Glomus will was like a lost city to Johnny. If he found it, he would get a reward. He would become famous, and he would be able to do something wonderfully generous and kind for his grandparents. What more could anyone ask? Johnny gazed dreamily out the window of the bus. The mountains were getting closer. In the distance on the horizon, he could see long, rumpled gray and blue lines. Lazily, Johnny leaned back on the seat and wondered what the week at Camp Chocorua. that Camp Chakarua would be like. And that's the end of chapter 3.